At Chapel Hill, you have to get a little card for a parking place, and you go down to a certain office, you fill out a form, and you stand there waiting patiently your turn to get authorization. So I walked up, and this lovely lady sitting there, and I handed her my completed form, and she looked at it and says, "Mister, do you work around here?" Can you imagine what it was like riding over here with Robert McMillan, Jim Jenkins, and Jane, listening to Wake Forest for 45 miles? This necktie was his gift to me. But I proved to him my loyalty because I had on as near a gold tie as I had. But it didn't quite fit, so Jim, en route, I had to change neckties so I'd be properly dressed for all of you. It's so wonderful to see you. Now you're going to have to excuse me because this is a journey of sentiment for me. Because Jim was right. The first thing we did was go over here to Mr. Royal's house. 74 years ago, 4 of us rolled up there to take up residence. My first roommate was Bill Ellington, whose dad was Register of Deeds of Wake County. The other 2 were the Helsebeck cousins. Bill Helsebeck was from King, North Carolina, and Joe Helsebeck was from Walnut Cove. You've never seen 4 more noisy people in the world. But dear Mrs. Royal, as genteel, gracious as she was, made us feel so much at home. Miss Winfred was there, of course, and William, her son. William had a lot to do with the cotton mill that was then existing in Wake Forest. And I was just sitting down on the front porch over there, remembering so many things just an hour ago. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself. In 1937, when my generation was graduating from high school in North Carolina, we were in pretty poor straits in this state. We were just barely moving away from the Depression. Now, there is a difference between the Great Depression and the recession we're experiencing right now. And I don't know if I look around this room, see how many more 91 and plus to know about those days. But I had a classmate sitting beside me in the grade school, and I noticed that his notebook paper was different from mine. And I became curious, and I set about to find out why. What he had done the night before was to save all the grocery store bags that he could collect, and he tore the long side to make his notebook paper. That's how tough it was. And every child in that class had the same experience. You see, Dallas in those days had 3 cotton mills, and they all closed, locked up. Within a week, the bank failed, and everything in and around and a part of our little hometown became in bankrupt status. You borrowed a cup of sugar across the neighbor's fence, and that's the way it was. I tell you that story because no one in that high school graduating class that year ever expected to get to go to college. No one. The Baptist minister in Dallas at that time was a man named Hubert Huggins. And my dad was chairman of the board there at the church, and he suggested to my father that I come up here and see if I couldn't qualify for some kind of scholarship. We drove up here walked in the Wade Hall to meet Dean D.B. Bryan. And I pronounce his name carefully because I want you to remember it. We sat there and talked a while, he and my father exchanging stories about the economics of our time. In a moment, he interrupted and he stopped and he looked straight at me and he said, "Son, do you want to go to college?" I said, "More than anything else, Dr. Bryan." He pulled out the drawer in his desk and he took a form and he wrote my name on the line, and it was a $50 tuition scholarship. That's how Bill Friday ever got any education beyond the high school. And his daughter's here, and I told her this story because I wanted her to know it from me, because he and this institution that day began to change my life forever. So I'm here to say thank you. And I'm here to say what I experienced, I'm sure hundreds of others did in those very dark and hard days that were so trying for everybody. But D.B. Bryan was that kind of compassionate, caring, very, very interesting human being. And when I was on the new campus once with President Hearn, I said, "Tom, I'm not going anywhere till I go see a portrait." He said, "What portrait do you want to go see?" I said, "I want to go see Dean Bryan, and I'll just leave you right here and I'll go find him." But there he was, where he belonged, on the honored wall at the new Wake Forest campus. So that's how I got here. And as I say, I walked in here that day over there with these three wonderful roommates. Joe and Bill were outdoorsmen. They believed being at home only to sleep. They wanted to hunt and fish and swim. They were great athletes. Bill Ellington was an artist. His dad was a very wonderful public official in Wake County. But we had a great time together in those first years. We all got assigned to different classes, and we would all, of course, compare our teachers and exchange stories about our teachers. Joe was 6'1", and he had the muscle structure of Tarzan. And a wonderful and beloved man here named Phil Utley was head of the physical education department. And Bill and Joe and I would go down and play basketball every afternoon we could get to do it, because we all played in high school. But it took quite a shining to Joe, because he going to make Joe a varsity star. But Coach Utley had forgotten something. That year, Wake Forest had Turk Apple, Vinnie Connery, Jim Waller, and I've forgotten the other, all American type basketball players. But we had great times together with them. But it was those teachers that made such a difference to us. Really wonderful people. I remember studying German under Dr. Garel, and he struggled with me, because that's a tough language. And why I was taking it, I could never figure out. But there I was. But he taught me some poetry, and I knew one verse of it. Du bist wie eine Blume, so rein, so schön, hot so. Ich schau dich an mein Mut in Herz hinein. One sentence, to me you are as a flower, ladies. That's all I remember. But he made us recite. And then I took chemistry, and I had a wonderful lab instructor named Lee Russell. Anybody in here remember Lee? But he took the whole class back there the first day, and he gave each of us 2 vials of clear liquid. And he said, pour the left one into the right one. We did, and the right one turned purple. I was hooked on qualitative analysis. But after that came quantitative analysis, and I left him right there. But they were such wonderful people. I had English under Dr. Aycock, a wonderful teacher. And Wake Forest in those days did something that was such a great thing to do. We had chapel, and you got to meet the people who made this institution so famous. I can still hear Dr. Kitchen lecturing to us about what this place really stood for. I was one of those that kept asking about Dr. Billy. I'd heard about him from the pulpit at the church. I said, who could tell me something about Dr. Billy Petit? But then one after another of these experiences, as you can see, 70 years later, are still as bright in my mind as yesterday morning. And that was because it was a first impression that you get, but primarily because this was a place at that time which had fewer than 1,000 students. And we knew each of us knew most everybody. And you had a group of professors who really wanted to be what that word was meant to be, a real teacher. Now, I didn't get to take courses under Dr. Sled, but I heard enough about him that I wish I could have taken a course. And then there was Skinny Pearson, and then there was Jasper Memory. I see all you smile when I say that. And I could go on, but it was a different place. And a year later, when I went over to NC State, I knew dramatically what Dr. Petit had fought so hard to inculcate here. He wanted Wake Forest to teach young people what being alive really meant, what contributing to your society really meant, what sense of obligation you have as a citizen to be a creative and productive and forward-looking individual. And the first class I had at NC State was running a weaving loom, making a piece of cloth. And I could tell from what I had remembered about my experience here that was wholly foreign to the intellectual climate of Wake Forest. But there were some really characters on this campus then. Fred. Oh, there's one of them right there. The bookstore. That was our student union in those days. But I mentioned Coach Utley. Most people don't appreciate, I think, what an impact a man who's really good at physical education does have on a student generation. As long as we keep teaching young people that it's so important to learn what physical education really means, because you carry it with you all your life. And if you don't exercise it, you become first a cardiac case. And I know that from my own experience. But Phil Utley, as you can see, with Joe Helsebeck, Bill Helsebeck, and myself, made a lifelong impression. Joe went on to be a very wonderful dentist in Surrey County. And as I mentioned, Joe, when he got through with the war and all, was chief pilot for Piedmont, and he was in that plane that dived into the ocean out of New Bern that Sunday morning. Never saw him again. But he was the kind of person, you see, that exemplified what I'm trying to say about my experience here. In his life, this place lit a flame that I am going to contribute, I'm going to give something back, I'm going to be something, and was not a shred of arrogance or pride in it. It was a duty And that was the lesson my generation carried out of here. At least I can say that from my own experience. Mary Greason's Jr. sitting over here. I remember his father so very well. I mean, anybody in here remember Al Doughton? There was a fellow running around here named Arnold Palmer, you know, in those days. Well, Al was a golf coach and a wonderful individual. You see, every student knew his teacher, or if he were aggressive enough, he could. And that had a benefit 24 hours a day. You just lived that way. And it was so refreshing each morning. Of course, the question came up when we all got here, well, where are you going to get your meals? So I'm walking down US 1, heading toward the campus, and there's a building down there on the corner where Miss Jo Williams ran a cafeteria restaurant. So I'm walking down there, first day I'm here, and this tall, angular figure standing there. And he stopped me and says, don't you want to eat your meals in here? Well, I didn't know any better. I said, sure, I'll go in here. Some years later, when he was Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of North Carolina, I reminded Joe Branch of that encounter. That's the way it was. This place was just full of people, destined to be a real circus. But there was a lot of humor, a lot of fun. Mr. Royal used to tell me that every time Dean Gully got in the car, and anybody could see him pulling out of the garage, wanted to stop the traffic on US 1 because he couldn't see over the steering wheel. That's a true story. Before I got my thoughts together about being with you today, I picked up Randall Hall's biography of William Lewis Petit. Now, I don't know how many of you have read that book. If you haven't, I hope you will. It's very important to you to read it in the sense of what happened to North Carolina in that generation of leaders. He was a truly remarkable man. He did a lot for the University of North Carolina, let me tell you, in helping to protect it against onslaughts that came from so many different sources. But he was a much bigger man than most people know historically. He roamed the South talking about what had to be and what had to happen. And he preached the quality of life for the poorest among us. He preached opportunity for people. And he preached stay with it, because he knew that change came slowly. But change had to come. And his great contribution to our culture, I think, was he was one of those individuals who set the course. He and people like Howard Odom and Frank Graham and Hubert Petit and many others of that generation, they were the people who guided the flagship and made things better for all of us. I wondered when I came here, I didn't really understand it, but I wondered why in the conversations I heard, so many references were made to that man, but more importantly about what he taught. And the group of people on the faculty here who were around him, who were great individualists. They didn't follow anybody's line. They had their own. But the important point was that you feel here on the campus in those days a great sense of challenge and freedom. You could say what you wanted to say, but you had to account for it now. And you had to be prepared. But the challenge was so different from leaving the 11th grade of the Dallas High School. Just like being put in the middle of the floor and spun around so fast You didn't know what you had encountered. But I'm here to say I'm incredibly grateful for that experience. I'll never forget that $50 tuition grant. I'll never forget this place, because I don't know who did it, but I am profoundly grateful for the fact that my three brothers, all of whom followed me here, all of whom are graduates, someone was kind enough to pay attention to Rudd, Dave, and John. So the Friday family is a Wake Forest family, you can see that. And the proof of that was whenever I would go home at Christmas, Rudd, Dave, and John would line up across the front door. And I had to sing the first verse of the Wake Forest alma mater. Or I didn't get in the house. So that's the way it was. And you're kind to let me come over. Thank you.